In the fall of 2022, a retired wildlife officer in Shannon County, Missouri, sat at a kitchen table in a house that had been in his family since before the Civil War and read a sentence written in pencil on paper so old it crumbled at the edges when he turned the page. The sentence was dated October of 1859. It described a creature standing on two legs at the edge of a cornfield in the light of a half moon, and the description matched, detail for detail, what that same man had seen on the same piece of ground 163 years later. The handwriting belonged to his great-great-grandfather. The creature it described is what the DOGMAN research community has been documenting across the Great Lakes, the Pacific Northwest, Appalachia, and the deep interior for decades. And the journal it was written in was one of nine handwritten volumes spanning 5 generations of the same family, all describing encounters with the same kind of animal on the same stretch of Ozark bottomland along Sinking Creek in the current river drainage, going back further than any single witness DOGMAN account I have ever come across. When I say this family lived with these things, I mean they lived with them the way you live with a neighbor you never speak to but see across the fence every year of your life. And the oldest stories, the ones the family told before they started writing them down, used language that most people outside the Ozarks would find difficult to accept. Language about kinship, language about blood, language that gave this video its title, and that I am going to spend the next hour putting into context, because the truth of what those old families meant when they said it is stranger and more significant than the words themselves suggest. The man who brought us these journals agreed to let us tell this story on the condition that we change his name and keep certain details about his property vague enough that nobody drives up to his gate. We will call him Mac. He spent the better part of 30 years working for the Missouri Department of Conservation as a wildlife damage management agent in the Ozark region. His territory covered parts of Shannon, Carter, Reynolds, and Dent counties, which is some of the most remote and heavily forested ground in the state. His job was handling conflicts between humans and wildlife, bears in dumpsters, coyotes taking calves, feral hogs tearing up pasture land, beavers flooding county roads. He trapped, he relocated, he euthanized when relocation was not an option, and he spent more time in the deep timber and creek bottoms of the southern Missouri Ozarks than most people spend indoors. He could age a deer by its teeth, sex a bobcat by its track width, and tell you whether a coyote kill was a single animal or a pack job by looking at the wound pattern on the carcass. He was not a man who misidentified animals. That was the whole point of his career. So, before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you are watching from. Thanks. Mac grew up in Shannon County. His people had been on the same ground since 1843, 2 years after the county was organized from Ripley County and named for George Shannon, the youngest member of the Lewis and Clark expedition. The original homestead sat along a feeder creek that runs into Sinking Creek, which itself feeds the current river about 6 miles upstream from Eminence. If you know the area, you know the terrain. Karst, geology, dolomite bluffs dropping straight into creek beds, springs that come out of the hillside at 48 degrees year-round, and feed pools clear enough to read a license plate at the bottom. Sinkholes that open up in pastures overnight and swallow fence posts. Caves in every ridge, some mapped and gated by the Forest Service, most unmapped and open, running back into the rock for distances nobody has measured. The Mark Twain National Forest covers most of the county. The Ozark National Scenic Riverways, the first national scenic river system in the country, runs the Current and the Jacks Fork right through the heart of it. Highway 19 cuts north to south through Eminence. After that, you are on county gravel and logging roads and 2 tracks that dead-end in hollows where the GPS signal drops out and the cell coverage has never existed in the first place. The population of Shannon County at the 2020 census was just over 7,000 people across more than 1,000 square miles. That is fewer than 7 people per square mile, and most of those 7 are clustered in Eminence, Winona, and Birch Tree along the paved roads. Get off the highways and into the hollows where the old families live, and you can go days without seeing another person. The families that settled these hollows in the 1830s and 40s were Scotch-Irish stock out of Kentucky and Tennessee and the Western Carolinas. The hollows swallowed them. 5 generations later, their descendants were still there, still on the same creeks, still telling stories that had not changed in 150 years because there was nobody around to tell them the stories were wrong. Mac's family was one of those. His grandmother, who died in 2021 at the age of 94, had lived her entire life within 8 miles of the house where she was born. She raised 4 children, buried 2 husbands, and maintained the old house the way her mother and grandmother had maintained it before her. She was the keeper of things. The family Bible with its birth and death records going back to the 1840s. The quilts. The cast iron skillets that had been seasoned by 6 generations of hands, and the journals. Mac knew about the journals the way you know about anything your grandmother mentions in passing and you never think to ask about until it is too late to ask. She would reference them occasionally. She would say that his great-great-grandfather had been a writing man, which in the context of antebellum Shannon County was unusual enough to be worth noting. She would say the family had always kept records. She never said what was in them. Mac assumed they were farm records. Crop yields, livestock counts, weather observations, the kind of thing a literate farmer in the 19th century might write down because nobody else in the hollow could read and someone needed to keep track. After his grandmother died, Mac and his sister spent 2 weeks cleaning out the house. The journals were in a cedar chest in the back bedroom, wrapped in oilcloth, stacked chronologically. 9 volumes. The earliest dated 1853, the most recent from 1968, written by Mac's great-uncle, a man who died in 1972, and who Mac remembered as a quiet old man who sat on the porch with a shotgun across his knees, watching the tree line until dark. Mac took the journals home. He did not open them for 3 months. When he finally sat down and started reading, it was a Tuesday evening in January of 2022, and by the time he looked up from the first volume, it was after 2 in the morning, and his coffee had gone cold, and his hands were shaking. The first journal was written by a man Mac knew only as a name in the family Bible. The handwriting was cramped and uneven, the spelling erratic, the grammar shaped by a border state dialect that had more in common with Elizabethan English than with anything taught in schools. But the observations were precise. The man described his homestead, the creek, the timber, the wildlife, the seasonal rhythms of the Ozark year, with the careful attention of someone who understood that survival depended on noticing details. He described planting corn and running hogs in the timber and hunting deer and turkey and bear. He described the neighbors, such as they were, scattered along the creek at intervals of a mile or more. He described the Osage, who still moved through the region on hunting expeditions even after the treaties of 1808 and 1825 had officially ceded their lands. He wrote about finding their camps along the river, the remains of fires and temporary shelters, and about a conversation he had with an Osage man through a combination of broken French and hand signs, in which the Osage man told him there were places along the creek where his people did not camp, not because the hunting was poor, because those places belonged to something else. And then, on a page dated September of 1855, the first entry appeared that made Mac's hands go still on the paper. The man described hearing sounds at night that he could not identify, coming from the ridge above the creek, low sounds, steady and rhythmic, that carried down the hollow with a clarity he associated with distance and elevation. He compared them to a wolf howl but said the pitch was wrong, lower than a wolf and with a pattern to it that repeated in ways wolf howls did not. He said his dogs would not go outside when the sounds came. They would lie flat on the floor of the cabin with their ears back and their eyes tracking something he could not see, and no amount of coaxing would get them past the threshold. He noted the date, the time, the weather, and the direction the sounds came from, and then he wrote a single sentence that Mac read 4 times before he could process it. He wrote that whatever was making those sounds was up on the ridge walking on 2 legs, because he could hear the footfalls between the vocalizations, and the rhythm of the footfalls was the rhythm of a man walking, not a 4-legged animal moving through brush. That was the first entry. Over the next 113 years, across 9 volumes and 5 generations of the same family, the journal entries described encounter after encounter with something living on the ridgelines and in the deep hollows around the homestead that walked upright, had the head and coloring of a large canine, stood taller than any man in the family had ever seen, and behaved with an intelligence and a restraint that every generation found more disturbing than the creature's size or appearance. The descriptions were consistent across a century and a half of observation. The creature was large, 7 feet or taller based on comparisons to trees and fence posts and door frames that each generation used as reference points. The fur was dark, described variously as black, deep brown, and in one entry from the 1890s, the color of walnut bark after rain. The head was canine, with a pronounced muzzle and ears that stood erect. The eyes reflected light at night with an amber or yellow-green shine. It moved on 2 legs, with a gait that every observer described as wrong for a human. A forward lean, a roll through the shoulders, a stride too long for its height. And it could drop to 4 legs and cover ground at a speed that the 1912 journal entry compared to a horse at full gallop, though the author noted the movement was more fluid than a horse, more like water running downhill. But the physical descriptions were not what kept Mac reading until 2 in the morning. What kept him reading was the relationship. The journals did not describe a predator terrorizing a homestead. They described something more complicated than that. Something that played out across generations like a slow conversation between 2 species that shared the same ground and had learned, over decades and then over a century, how to occupy it together. The earliest entries described avoidance. The creature stayed on the ridges. The family stayed in the hollow. The boundary was the creek itself, which ran roughly east to west through the property, with the homestead and the cleared fields on the south bank, and the uncut timber climbing the north-facing slope to the ridge above. The creature moved along that ridge at night. The family heard it. The dogs reacted. Occasionally, in the gray light before dawn or the last minutes of dusk, someone would see it standing at the tree line where the cleared ground ended and the timber began, watching the cabin the way a man watches a house he is thinking about buying. Then it would turn and move into the trees, and the family would go about their day, and nobody would mention it unless someone new married into the family and needed to be told what to expect. The 1860s entries, written during and after the Civil War, described a shift. Shannon County was guerrilla country during the war. Bushwhackers and jayhawkers and Confederate irregulars moved through the hollows, burning farms and killing livestock and settling old grudges under the cover of wartime chaos. The family journal described 2 separate incidents in which armed men approached the homestead at night and were driven off by sounds from the ridge. The second entry, from the winter of 1863, described a group of riders coming up the creek road after dark. The dogs started barking. The family barred the door and loaded their rifles. And then, from the timber above the house, a vocalization came down the hollow that the journal described as deeper than thunder and closer than the creek. The riders stopped. The horses refused to go further. The men turned around and left. The journal entry ended with a sentence that Mac read 3 times. It said the creature on the ridge had driven off the riders the way a man drives coyotes away from his livestock. It used the word protected. That was the beginning of the kinship language. Over the following decades, as the family's relationship with the creature settled into a pattern of territorial coexistence, the journal entries and the oral traditions that surrounded them began to describe the creature in terms that blurred the line between neighbor and family. The 1880s entries, written by the original author's son, described the creature as belonging to the place the same way the family belonged to it. He wrote that the ridge was its ground and the hollow was their ground and the creek between them was the line that both sides respected. He used the phrase kin to the holler, which in Ozark dialect meant something closer to bound to the land than related by blood. But the phrase could be read either way, and over the following generations, as the stories were told and retold by Pso, who were not reading the journals but hearing the accounts from grandparents and great-aunts who had heard them from their grandparents and great-aunts, the language shifted. Kin to the holler became kin to us. Belonging to the land became belonging to the family. The creature that protected the homestead during the Civil War became, in the telling, a guardian that had chosen this family, that had bred into the hollow the way a line of hunting dogs breeds into a kennel, becoming part of the place through generations of shared territory. And that is where the title of this video comes from. The oldest Ozark families in the deepest hollows of Shannon and Carter and Reynolds counties had oral traditions that described their relationship with these creatures in the language of blood and kinship and breeding. The stories said the creatures bred with the hollow, meaning they established a permanent territorial bond with a specific piece of ground and the humans on it. In some versions, told by people 3 and 4 generations removed from the original observers, The stories describe children born to isolated families with unusual strength and unusual hair, and an unusual comfort in the dark, and those stories attributed those traits to the proximity of the creatures. The implication was interbreeding. The reality, as the journals make clear, was something different, and in many ways more remarkable. The creatures were not breeding with humans. They were coexisting with specific human families for so many generations that the oral tradition could not distinguish between neighboring and belonging. The proximity was so permanent, so intimate in its territorial overlap, so consistent across a century and a half of observation, that the only language the old families had for a relationship that deep was the language of kinship. You call something family when it has been on your ground longer than your oldest memory and shows no sign of leaving. Mac read all 9 journals in the space of 2 weeks. He read them the way he had read wildlife survey data for 30 years, looking for patterns, inconsistencies, behavioral signatures that repeated across time. What he found was consistent enough to make a field biologist's career, if the subject of the study were anything the scientific establishment was prepared to accept. Instead, it was a detailed behavioral record of a dogman population occupying the same territory across a span of time that no other witness in the field has come close to matching. The creature, or more accurately the creatures, because the journals described at least 2 individuals operating simultaneously in several entries spanning the 1880s through the 1920s, used the same territory across the entire 160-year observation window, the ridgeline above the creek. The deep hollow to the northwest where 3 drainages converged in a tangle of old-growth timber that had never been cut because the terrain was too steep for logging equipment. The limestone bluffs along the current river about 2 miles east of the homestead, where caves opened into the rock at elevations that were difficult to reach on foot and impossible to see from the river below. The creatures moved between these 3 areas on routes that the journals described with enough consistency across generations to map. Mac did map them. He took a USGS topographic quadrangle of the area and plotted every location reference from the journals, using the landmarks the authors described to pin each sighting or sound report to a specific point on the terrain. When he was done, he was looking at a territory of roughly 12 square miles, centered on the creek drainage, bounded by terrain features that any wildlife biologist would recognize as natural territorial boundaries, ridge lines to the north and south, the current river to the east, a stretch of open bottomland to the west where the forest gave way to hay meadows that the creature appeared to avoid, a defined range, used consistently for over a century. The behavioral patterns were equally consistent. The creatures were nocturnal or crepuscular, appearing most often in the hours around dawn and dusk and active through the night. They vocalized regularly, with the journal descriptions remaining remarkably stable across generations. Low-frequency sounds with tonal variation and a repeating structure that multiple authors compared to speech without being willing to call it speech. They marked territory through physical signs on trees, deep vertical gouges in the bark of hardwoods at heights that exceeded 7 feet, always in groups of 4 parallel marks that the 1912 author specifically noted corresponded to 4 claws or 4 fingers, not the 5 you would expect from a bear. They avoided direct contact with the family but maintained proximity. They appeared to monitor the homestead from the ridge, especially during periods of unusual activity, visitors arriving, construction, livestock disturbances, and they responded to perceived threats against the homestead with defensive behavior that multiple generations described in terms of protection. The 1904 entry described a pack of feral dogs that had been killing livestock in the drainage. The family had been losing chickens and a calf to the pack and had been unable to locate them. Over the course of 3 nights, the journal author heard sounds from the ridge that he described as organized movement, multiple individuals covering the terrain in what he interpreted as a coordinated sweep. On the 4th morning, he found the remains of 4 feral dogs in the creek bed below the ridge. The kills were efficient, cervical fractures and deep bite wounds to the throat, no feeding. The carcasses had been left where they fell. The feral dog problem was over. The journal entry noted that whatever killed the dogs had done so without being asked and without being seen and had left the evidence where the family would find it. He wrote that it was like having a neighbor clear a fallen tree from your road without being told it was blocking traffic, a courtesy between territorial residents. That entry crystallized something Mac had been circling for days. The creatures were not tolerating the family's presence. They were managing it. The relationship was not passive coexistence. It was active territorial diplomacy conducted by a non-human intelligence across multiple generations of both species. The creatures understood that the family was permanent. The family understood that the creatures were permanent. And over 160 years, the two populations had worked out an arrangement that benefited both. The family got a homestead that was remarkably free of the predator problems that plagued every other farm in Shannon County. No bear in the corn, no coyotes in the calves, no feral dogs in the chickens. The creatures got a human presence that was predictable, contained, and quiet. A family that stayed in its hollow and did not expand into the timber, and did not bring outsiders onto the ground, and above all, did not talk about what lived on the ridge. The silence was the price of the arrangement, and every generation paid it. Mac finished the journals and sat with them for a month before he went back to the property. He had not been to the old homestead regularly since his grandmother's death. The house was still there, maintained but unoccupied, surrounded by the same timber and the same creek and the same ridgeline that his ancestors had described for 160 years. He drove out in March of 2022, parked in the yard, and stood in the grass looking at the tree line where the cleared ground ended and the north-facing slope began. He told me he stood there for 20 minutes listening. The forest was quiet in a way that he recognized from 30 years of fieldwork. Too quiet. The bird activity was suppressed. The squirrels, which should have been moving in the oaks along the creek, were absent. Something was exerting a suppressive effect on the smaller wildlife, the way a large predator's presence will empty an area of prey species and alarm-calling birds. He came back the next weekend with a pair of trail cameras. Personal equipment, not department property. He had been retired for a year by then, having left the Missouri Department of Conservation at 59, telling his supervisor he was done, which was true, but the reasons he was done went deeper than he could explain to anyone who had not read what he had read. He placed the first camera on a game trail along the creek, aimed at a natural crossing point where the water ran shallow over a gravel bar. He placed the second on a post at the edge of the tree line, aimed up the slope toward the ridge, covering a corridor of old-growth oak and hickory that rose steeply from the creek bottom. He used scent elimination protocol from his years running predator surveys. He checked the cameras every 2 weeks. The first 3 checks produced standard Ozark forest traffic. White-tailed deer using the creek crossing, a bobcat, 2 coyotes, a black bear, which surprised him because bears were uncommon in that specific drainage during the spring. On the 4th check, in mid-May, the creek crossing camera had been pulled off its tree. The mounting strap was still attached to the trunk, torn through the bark in a channel that went deep enough to expose the cambium. The camera housing was on the ground 10 feet from the tree, cracked along the seam, the lens facing up. The SD card was inside and functional. Mac retrieved it, drove home, and put it in his computer. The card held a recording triggered sometime after 1 in the morning. Infrared. The motion sensor had activated, and what had walked into the frame was something Mac had been reading about for a month, but had never seen with his own eyes or through any lens. It moved through the creek crossing from right to left, upright, and the water that should have been mid-calf on a man of average height barely reached what Mac could only describe as its ankle. The proportions were wrong for a human. The arms hung too far past the hips, the shoulders were too wide for the waist, the head in profile showed the elongated muzzle and the erect pointed ears that 5 generations of his family had described in pencil on crumbling paper. The infrared washed out detail, but the shape was unmistakable. It crossed the creek in 4 strides, paused on the far bank, and turned toward the camera. Mac could see the eye shine, 2 bright points reflecting the infrared emitter, set forward on the skull the way a predator's eyes sit. It stood there, facing the camera, for what Mac estimated was 3 or 4 seconds. Then it walked toward the camera. The image grew brighter as it closed the distance. Then a shape filled the bottom of the frame, something reaching up from below, and the image spun and went dark. The second camera, the one aimed up the slope, had not been touched. It recorded through the night without triggering. Whatever had crossed the creek and destroyed the first camera had done so without passing through the second camera's field of view. It had approached the creek from a direction that avoided the slope camera entirely. It had known both cameras were there, chosen to destroy one, and left the other running. Mac sat at his kitchen table looking at the footage on his laptop screen and felt the floor shift under him. 30 years of wildlife management. 30 years of being the person who explained the unexplainable by fitting it into a category that the system recognized. And here, on a $5 SD card from a camera that had been ripped off a tree on his own family's property, was something that did not fit in any category the system had ever built. He replaced the creek camera the following weekend. This time he put it higher, at 10 feet, using climbing steps screwed into the trunk. He angled it downward at the crossing. He also placed a third camera, a unit he bought specifically for this purpose, 100 yards upstream, aimed at a section of the creek bank, where the mud stayed soft enough to hold prints. Within the first 2 weeks, the third camera captured tracks, clear impressions in the creek bank mud, photographed in morning light by the camera's daytime mode. Canid morphology, 4 toes with claw marks. But the size was wrong for any canid in Missouri. The tracks measured just under 6 inches long and close to 5 inches wide. For reference, the largest gray wolf track in the Missouri Department of Conservation's records is about 4.5 by 3 3/4. The department's official position is that there are no wolves in the southern Ozarks. These tracks were bigger than the biggest wolf on record in a state that does not officially have wolves, and they were in a bipedal gait pattern with a stride length that Mac measured at 48 inches. He had spent decades measuring predator tracks. He knew the math. A canid producing those tracks while walking upright would need to be carrying 300 pounds or more through the chest and shoulders to leave impressions that deep in creek bank clay. Over the following 6 months, Mac documented what his family had been documenting for 160 years. The creatures were still there, still using the same territory, still moving along the same ridgeline, the same creek corridors, the same routes to and from the bluffs along the current river, still nocturnal, still vocal. The sounds came through his open truck window on June nights, when he sat in the yard after dark listening the way his great-great-grandfather had listened. Low, structured vocalizations carrying down the hollow from the ridge, with a tonal quality that sat in a register he felt in his chest before he processed it with his ears. His dogs, a pair of coonhounds that had treed bears and run bobcats without hesitation their entire working lives, would not leave the porch when the sounds came. They pressed against the door and whined. Mac had seen those dogs face a 400-pound boar at a bait station without flinching. On the nights when the ridge vocalized, they would not step off the boards. He lost 3 more cameras between May and October of 2022. Every one was pulled from its mounting, the housing cracked, the cards recoverable. The footage on each card showed a variation of the same sequence. Motion trigger, a shape entering the frame, brief recording before the camera was grabbed and pulled down. On one card, the last frame before the image went dark showed a hand. 5 fingers, not 4. A broad palm with long digits and